Welcome to Lecture 3. For Lecture 3, we will be examining the Dream of the Rood and Germanic culture. We've already talked about the importance of the fusion of Germanic culture and Christianity in Lecture 2. In Lecture 3, we're going to see an even greater engagement. Before we look at the poem, there are several things that we need to think about. There was a date that you wanted to keep in mind. I asked you to keep in mind. I would do that for the test. 597, the coming of Roman Christianity to England. When Pope Gregory I, one of the great medieval popes, commissioned the missionary activity to England, he suggested to the missionaries not to simply go in and to destroy the Germanic pagan temples, but to actually hold services there, and that the superior message of Christianity, as he understood it, would indeed bring about the conversion of the people. Sure enough, it must have happened, because in roughly 40 years after 597, Christianity had made significant gains, in many ways because of support of local chieftains, but probably because it offered to Germanic peoples a vision of life beyond. Germanic religion had done very little. It was very much a this world religion. Christianity, of course, is an eschatologically focused religion. I know it's a fancy word. It's a focus on the last things and after this life. So, when we look at this poem, The Dream of the Rood, by the way, we're on page 32 in the Norton Anthology. Rood is the Old English word for cross. When was the poem written? There's a very intriguing, and this is in your text too, monumental cross at Ruthwell. If we were in Scotland, they would pronounce it Rivell. If you want to go see it, which you can in a now what is termed redundant church in Scotland, you can see it. Art historians date the work, the runic letters, to sometime before 750. Since part of the poem actually shows up on the edges of the cross, that surely must mean that the poem was written before 750. Speakers in the poem, there are two, the cross and the dreamer. Personification, a tremendously important concept because the cross itself is given voice. And given voice, that means that it takes on the form of a human being. Prosopopoeia is the rather fancy word for this more extended personification. We'll leave it with personification here. There's an envelope pattern in the poem. We begin with the dreamer, we then go to the narrative of the cross, and finally return to the narrative of the dreamer himself. There are questions that you might have, and we will think about that. Why doesn't Christ speak in the poem? Probably one of the things to be said is the crucifixion story in the Gospels don't have Jesus saying a great deal. In fact, if you take all four Gospels, there's a traditional idea that there are 7 expressions from the cross. That probably would not make a narrative poem. In fact, those 7 sayings of the cross are not even included in the poem, since the perspective is that of the cross. We'll think about why in just a moment. Another question that you might have, why does the cross assume central importance? Because it looks like after the point of Jesus' death and burial, that the cross then becomes the most significant emblem. There are probably historical reasons for that we'll investigate in a moment. Before we start looking at the poem, I want to think about some Germanic elements. The fusion of cultures is very important. Every religion in the world is influenced by a larger culture. And whenever a religion goes to a different cultural location, there's often a level of accommodation that happens with that situation. So if we think about several Germanic elements, apart from Christianity first, this may help us in understanding this poem. Germanic culture in England and on the continent was very much a warrior-based society culture. That means that you have a military leader and his fighting band of retainers. This person, of course, is typically referred to as a chieftain or king. You have central values of strength and determination, which means that your power as a leader and a military ruler is only as long and only as good as you're able to wield the sword. Loyalty to one's military leader. If you are a part of that fighting band of retainers, you are obligated to not only carry out the desire and wishes of your military lord, but also, should anything happen to him, to avenge his death. The sharing of gifts and treasures. That which is gained, a good, noble lord will share the things which he has gained in battle with his fighting band of retainers. Let's look at the poem. In the beginning, this is page 33, we see that the dreamer sees across and he's not really sure what he sees because there's this constant changing in his dream. Notice, by the way, it isn't a dream. It's going to be important. Dreams were seen as revelatory. We've already seen that in Cædmon's hymn. The same is true here in this poem, The Dream of the Rood. Notice how he describes it. He's not exactly sure at first what he sees. Line 11. Clearly, this was no criminal's gallows, but holy spirits were beholding it there, men on this earth, all that mighty creation. The tree was triumphant, and I tarnished by sin, begrimed with evil. I beheld glory's trunk, garnished with grandeur, gleaming in bliss, all plated with gold, precious gemstones, had graciously graced the Lord's tree. Yet I could see signs of ancient strife beneath that gold. It had begun bleeding on the right side. I was all bereft with sorrows. That splendid sight made me afraid. Because he sees a kind of constant changing between the world of glorification and the world of suffering. The cross begins to speak at line 33. I saw the Lord of mankind coming with great haste, so that he might climb on me. Whoops. Whoops. What happened there? If you read the Gospels carefully, you can't miss the point. Jesus was wearied out. He's not going to be hastening to climb on the cross. In fact, in the Gospels, there is someone compelled to carry Jesus' cross to Calvary because he's unable to do it. The Germanic cultural fusion here brings together a different kind of vision where Jesus is the triumphal giver in battle. The cross itself is a battlefield between the forces of good and evil, which of course Jesus wins, although he dies in the process, of course, to be resurrected later. So that kind of fusion of those two worlds is significant here. Notice, by the way, on the next page, 34, line 35 beginning, the cross responds to this approaching Christ. Then I did not dare act against the Lord's word, bow down or fall to pieces when I felt the surface of the earth trembling. Although I might have destroyed the foes, I stood in place. Look at that. The cross has become like a military retainer. I wanted to just knock them all out. I didn't approve of what they were doing, but I couldn't do it. Because our cross here, interestingly enough, is both Christ's companion in a military sense and also the means of torture. So the cross itself is a kind of double image in the poem between the world of suffering and the world of victory. We have the burial of Christ, and notice that the cross itself is also buried. According to tradition, the cross on which Jesus was crucified was itself buried. Constantine's mother, Helena, actually found it in Constantinople, brought it back to Jerusalem in the 4th century, and as a result of that, there was a religious feast established. The earliest symbols for Christianity did not include the cross. The cross was an emblem of shame for the early church. The fish was the original symbol. It's only with the 4th, 5th, and 6th, 7th centuries that the cross itself becomes a sort of central emblem, probably related to the concept of Constantine in battle. At the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, he had his soldiers to paint on their shields a Chi Rho, a P with an X over it, if you're thinking in terms of Greek letters. Those became the sort of initial emblems for understanding the cross. That may be the kind of cross that we have in mind here. Clearly, the poem picks up on some of the celebratory aspects of the Feast of the Holy Cross, as has been noted. The burial of the cross happens by friends. It is then found, and it assumes a central place of prominence. One of the things that you might note is there's very little attention given to Jesus' resurrection here. Medieval Christianity places a good deal more attention on the crucifixion than upon the resurrection. At different times in the history of the Christian church and in different aspects and facets of the Christian church, different aspects of the life of Christ have dominated the assumptions. For the medieval world, it is going to be the crucifixion. But this is not the Christ of agony. This is also the Christ of victory. This is the victorious Christ. Line about 100. There he tasted death, yet the Redeemer arose with his great might to help mankind. Then he rose to heaven. He will come again to this middle earth to seek out mankind on Judgment Day, the Redeemer himself, God Almighty, and his angels with him, so that he will judge. Notice how quickly the resurrection is passed over, almost in a creed-like way, like, say, for example, as some religious traditions say, the Apostles' Creed. It's very quickly handled because the importance here is on the event of the suffering itself. The dreamer then closes out our poem on page 36, contemplating a day when he will be reunited with his friends who have gone before. He says he doesn't possess many powerful friends on earth. Notice around line 139 that he sees himself seated at a feast in heaven with his friends, a reunion scene. Keep this in mind as we move forward. This is going to sound like a hall scene in a Germanic hall where you have a military leader, indeed, feasting his fighting band of retainers. Tremendously important idea. The Dream of the Rood is one of the clearest examples of a fusion of traditions. So by way of conclusion, the fusion of Germanic and Christian elements, Christ as Germanic warrior, is very clear in this poem, strikingly so. The cross as military retainer. He too fights for Christ, but he's also restrained because he knows that he must fulfill a kind of will in order for the experience to be meaningful and productive. And finally, we see the importance of dreams as literary devices. Perhaps to avoid blasphemy. After all, one didn't have to give an account for whatever happened in a dream. But probably also to arrive at that kind of mystical experience that we'll see typifies a good deal of medieval Christianity. Enjoy your reading of the Dream of the Rood.